Ok, bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Je vais parler la première partie de ce teaching en français et la deuxième partie en anglais. So the first part will be in French and the second part in English. Donc, ça, c'est notre deuxième teaching, les mouvements des femmes et la situation de la pandémie en Iran. Avant de commencer, je vais passer la parole à Dolores Chu qui va faire la reconnaissance territoriale et après, Marie va nous parler des points techniques pour gérer mieux et comprendre mieux la structure de ce webinaire. Donc, je passe la parole à Dolores pour faire la reconnaissance territoriale avant de commencer. Dolores?
Thank you, Leila, and so happy to see everyone. So at WDO, Femmes de Origine, we would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded indigenous lands. Ghanaian Gahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojaga, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We support the ongoing struggles of Indigenous people, the original inhabitants of Turtle Island, who, as a
en raison du colonialisme des colons, souffrent de dépossession,
destruction of culture and way of life, including more egalitarian gender relations. The systemic and structural inequality and racism of settler colonialism in Canada is made very visible by the fault lines that the COVID-19 crisis has thrown up.
Shall I will, thank you, Dolores. Thank you, Dolores. Just a few words to explain how, some of the technical matters so that everybody can, fully participate. If everyone who is online can just make sure that they have their microphone turned off when they're not speaking. I think most of the spectators will not have their microphones on in any case, but and also the videos turned off when it's not you who's speaking. And then perhaps participants, just for the participants, if you click on your participant icon, you will see a little box pop up, and that's where you can actually raise your hand to speak and to also turn your mic off if you need to. Another button down there, which is important, is the chat, no, not the chat button, but the Q&A, question and answer button. This is where you can write your questions and we will take them on at the end. We plan to have a question and answer session after the two presentations, I believe. And also there's an important interpretation button. Donc, il y a de la traduction simultanée. Comme j'ai expliqué, il y a un bouton en bas pour le micro. Alors, c'est là où vous devez allumer votre micro si jamais on vous donne la parole. Mais normalement, on va procéder avec, pour les questions et réponses, en posant ces questions-là par écrit dans la boîte questions-réponses. Et aussi important, c'est que il y a de l'interprétation simultanée, comme j'ai mentionné, et il y a un bouton pour ça. Vous pouvez peser sur la flèche et choisir anglais ou français selon la langue dans laquelle vous voulez écouter. Alors, je pense que c'est tout. Et puis, si jamais il y a des journalistes, pourriez-vous vous identifier ou bien dans la question-réponse pour qu'on sache que vous êtes là, et puis avec vos coordonnées. Alors, merci beaucoup et puis bonne conférence. Leila?
Merci Marie. Donc, je vais commencer par introduire très brièvement notre collectif. Donc, je vais vous partager un petit diapo. Donc, la Femme de diverses origines est un collectif d'organisations populaires de femmes avec une perspective anti-impérialiste qui organise des activités pour marquer la Journée internationale des femmes surtout, et pour faire ressortir les liens entre les politiques mondiales et la situation des femmes d'ici, pour partager nos expériences de lutte et pour se mobiliser contre les injustices et le droit de toutes et toutes de vivre dans la dignité. Donc, aujourd'hui, c'est notre deuxième série de webinaires où nous allons apprendre des situations dans différents pays. Aujourd'hui, on va parler de l'Iran. On va avoir 3 intervenants. Imam Achouf qui va parler au premier, Saïda Khadir qui va parler au deuxième, et puis Nassim Nourouzi qui va parler dans la deuxième partie du webinaire. La première partie va être sur la situation de la pandémie en Iran, et la deuxième partie va être sur le mouvement des femmes en Iran. Donc, on va commencer par Nima. Je vais demander à chacun de parler 10 minutes max pour la première partie. On va passer après à la période de questions-réponses. Avant que Nima commence, j'aimerais demander à Mali de l'introduire, et après, quand Saïda va commencer à parler, je vais l'introduire encore. Mali.
Yes, hi, I'm going to introduce Nima. Nima Machouf is born in France and now lives in Montreal. She's a researcher, epidemiologist, and very involved in Canadian politics. She's one of the founders of the Iranian Women Association of Montreal almost 30 years ago. She's originally from Iran, obviously, and has a PhD in public health.
Un doctorat en santé publique de l'Université de Montréal. Elle est spécialisée en santé publique et maladies infectieuses, et particulièrement VIH-Sida. Elle est la mère de 3 enfants, et voilà, elle va parler.
Merci Mali. On va donner la parole à Nima Machouf qui va nous parler de la pandémie en Iran pendant 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will speak in English because I think more of the people speak English here.
Merci tout le monde. Je vais parler en anglais parce que je pense que la majorité des gens parlent anglais, même si c'est pas mon langage de choix, mais je pense que c'est mieux que je parle en anglais. Mais si il me manque certains mots, je vais vous demander de l'aide. Avant de commencer à parler de la crise, je veux vous parler de la situation dans laquelle la situation du COVID a émergé. C'est très important. Le contexte est très important. En novembre, il y a eu une grande rébellion qui
actually your other screen is covered up by stuff over there.
Je ne sais pas si quelqu'un parle. Je pense que les gens doivent être sur mute. Il y a eu une grande protestation et comme Amnesty International a dit, environ 100 000 personnes ont été tuées. Il y a 7 000 personnes qui ont été arrêtées, incluant des enfants. Et on sait tous qu'est-ce qui se passe dans les prisons des régimes dictatoriaux. Les manifestations ont continué jusqu'en janvier, quand Nassim Soleiman a été tué par les Américains.
Big conflict that rise again between US and Iran, and dans la foulée de cette affaire, in those crises, chaos, the Iranian government shut down the Ukrainian airplane and killed another 150 persons. Why this is important? Because during this period, the government, the way that the government talked to the people, the way that the government acted with the people was attacking and attacking the people. And meantime, in February, there was, in mid-February, there was the anniversary of the revolution. And 21 of February, there was elections, legislative elections. So the government, after all those crises, needs some attention from the people, needs to say, to show that they have credibility and people are with him, are with them. So when COVID came to Iran, to the country, they didn't want to talk about COVID because they wanted big demonstration for the anniversary of the revolution. They want huge participation of the people to the elections. So they keep it quiet. And even if they know the virus is already there. At the beginning, we talk about February. So at the beginning, there was no drug to relieve, to treat people. But there was tests, and little by little, all the world knew how to deal with this disease and what to do with this disease. But essentially, it's a public health crisis. It's not, so the government has to protect their people to be infected by the virus. All we can do is that. All we can do is to protect people from taking the disease. But what happened against in Iran? Because of the relation between Iran and China, Iran was the second country in which COVID came. So 24 of February, or just a few days after the election, the Vice Minister of Health, Iraj Harirchi, came in a press conference to say, no, all those people who are talking about COVID in Iran, it's fake news. They are our enemies that are talking about that. We are full of control in the country. And even if one of those deputy from Rome went to the parliament and said, hey, people, wake up. There are 50 persons killed, died, 50% died from COVID in Rome, from the personnel of health, doctors, nurses, and their family. The Vice Minister of Health, what he said? He said, no, this is lie. All those people who talk about this is because they are our enemy. And it's just against the government. So they didn't want to take care of this crisis, and all began here. For days and days, the government said that there is no COVID in Iran, and continue to do whatever you do. The COVID, the epidemic, the epicenter was in Rome, a city, holy city. And they didn't want to quarantine Rome, even if the people said, oh, look, people are dying around us, do something. They didn't want to do because it was Rome. And it was like, if we do this, it's in their mind, because they didn't think about it as a public health crisis. They think about it as usual, as always, like a political crisis. So they said, we don't want to confine Rome, because it's like if we said that we have a problem, and they always want to say we don't have any problem. And I don't know if you know what means 50 person dying from COVID. Here in Canada or in Quebec, when we had 50 deaths from COVID, it was a time then we had around 400 people already in the hospital, and we had something like 6,000 people infected already. Here in Quebec, where the quarantine was made installed, as we had only 13 people infected. So that means that a huge number of people in Iran was already infected when the government said, no, there is no crisis and everything is under control. So the huge problem with COVID in Iran was
Le plus grand
because
problème avec le COVID en Iran, c'est que ça n'a pas été pris au sérieux comme une crise de santé publique et ça n'a pas été pris en charge. Maintenant, on parle de presque 96 000 personnes infectées et c'est sûrement plus. Le problème avec le COVID, c'est qu'il faut que les gens restent en santé parce que quand ils sont malades, il n'y a rien à leur offrir. Fin février, début mars, les gens étaient infectés, mais il n'y avait rien à leur offrir comme service. Est-ce que je suis partie?
hear me. Okay, you hear me. Okay. And that's it. So when you have many people infected at the same time, the healthcare system cannot afford to take care of the people, obviously. No one in the world can afford that. We see what happened in Italy and what happened in Spain, that they didn't also act rapidly, or what happens in US. In US, they act exactly the same way as Iran did. They said, no, this is a political, they look at it as a political crisis. And they say, no, if they talk about COVID in US, it's because those are our enemy and it is the fault of China. And they didn't want to take it, to protect their people. Exactly the same way that they act in Iran. So that's why in Iran we had, it's one of the countries where more than 150 people from the health system, doctors and nurses, died. They died from COVID, and it's a huge loss for the country. And in the prison, COVID is in the prison. COVID is everywhere in the prison. People ask to the government to release the prisoners, or at least the political prisoners, and the government released many prisoners. But you know which kind of prisoners they release? Those who were for corruption, the friends of the government who were in the jail for corruptions and things like this. Not the political prisoners. They didn't release the political prisoners, so they are there. Now, fortunately, Iran has gone through the peak, and now the epidemic seems controlled because fortunately, they have access to one of the drugs which is very cheap and is produced in Iran, chloroquine, a drug that even here we don't have access now. So they treat people with chloroquine. They test people with, in fact, the diagnosis in Iran was done by MRI more than by test, because MRI was disponible everywhere and it was cheaper than using tests. And that's it. But regarding other aspects of the health care system, because it was a public health crisis, government, if the Iranian government at the beginning take it as it was, he could manage it, because public health in Iran is very powerful. When I go to the Congress, AIDS Congress or Hepatitis Congress, Iran, especially for hepatitis, Iran is one of the countries where everybody take it as a model, because the problem of drug consumption is so huge in Iran that they take it as a real health problem, and they manage the situation. So in public health, the people in Iran, they have enough personal, professionals, and the knowledge and the professionals. So if the crisis was well taken prise en charge, we would not have those problems now. Thank you. And I can answer the question later.
Merci, Nima. Oui, on va revenir sur les questions après que Saïdé va parler aussi. Donc, je vais introduire Saïdé avant qu'elle commence à parler. Saïdé Khadir, il est né en Iran. Elle est à Montréal depuis l'âge de 4 ans.
Elle est à Montréal depuis l'âge de 4 ans. She's in Montreal since 4 years old.
À l'époque de Charles, du gouvernement actuel. Elle a pratiqué la médecine d'urgence.
She practiced in the SHIM, in emergency medicine, and now she's co-founder of a coalition of doctors for public health. She's also a member of a group against the embargo on Cuba.
Écrit un article dans le Devoir sur la situation de COVID en Iran. Donc, je vais partager le lien dans le chat si vous voulez voir l'article plus tard. Et je laisse la parole à Saïdé Khadir pour nous parler de la pandémie et de son point de vue sur la situation en Iran pendant 10 minutes, s'il te plaît.
Bonjour, vous m'entendez? Vous m'entendez bien? Okay.
Oui,
Donc,
oui, ça a été.
OK, très bien, merci beaucoup. Donc, je vais faire mon discours en français, si possible, parce que je suis plus à l'aise. Alors, la pandémie a créé une situation de crise sanitaire et économique pour tous les pays, les peuples, les
countries and people.
Au Québec, même, les derniers chiffres de mortalité s'approchent plus des États-Unis et ont dépassé l'Italie si on tient compte des personnes mortes dans les CHSLD. Donc, même, on voit surprenamment que les pays du Nord global éprouvent des problèmes d'approvisionnement en termes de masques ou de protection ou de médicaments très de base, ce qui n'était pas attendu. Mais maintenant, comme notre sujet, c'est l'Iran, est lourdement touché par la COVID-19, maintenant dépassé par la Chine.
And right now, Turkey has higher cases. What is different with Iran, and this is what we need to talk about, are the economics. We need to talk about this. This is historically the worst sanctions. Even if we are against Iran, we need to talk about this problem. What does it mean for Iran?
Guerre, c'est pas une sanction, c'est un affaiblissement de la base, de l'infrastructure, de ce qui est le tissu social, service public et sociétal. Maintenant, il faut préciser la nature de ces sanctions. L'Iran fait face à des sanctions depuis 1979 qu'il contournait tant bien que mal de différentes façons. Mais maintenant, ce qui est particulier, c'est que toute compagnie qui fait affaire avec l'Iran, y compris les compagnies pharmaceutiques ou de matériel médical, vont avoir des sanctions secondaires de la part des États-Unis. Alors, c'est des sanctions qui sont jugées extraterritoriales, illégales, à la même manière que Cuba. Et ce qu'il y a aussi, c'est que beaucoup de gens, des protagonistes de ces sanctions, vont soit ne pas en parler, croyant, pour avancer finalement leur position, soit ne pas dire que finalement, même si il y a une exception sur papier pour les médicaments, dans les faits, il y a presque pas de transactions de médicaments parce que les transactions bancaires sont interdites, les assurances et les compagnies de transport sont interdites. Donc, toute transaction bancaire est sujet à des sanctions de la part des États-Unis. Donc, les pays dans le monde, la majorité ne sont pas d'accord avec de tels types de sanctions parce qu'ils sont injustes, illégales et très aléatoires. Elles peuvent s'appliquer après à n'importe quel pays. Elles n'ont pas été données par l'ONU, par exemple, qui les condamne, soit dit en passant. Donc, concrètement aussi, ce que ça veut dire, c'est que l'Iran, qui vendait bon an, mal an environ 2 millions de barils de pétrole par jour,
selling approximately 2 million barrels of oil per day. Today, they can only sell approximately 150,000. Saudi Arabia sells 14 millions, and Iran can only sell 150,000. And the oil price, as we know, decreased. Iran has 80 million inhabitants, which means way more than Saudi Arabia. Right now, there is a budgetary deficit in Iran. Canada is healthier and has a different economy than Iran, which means that the deficit in Iran is huge. The COVID crisis has led to shortages in Iran, medical equipment, treatment. Healthcare providers work very hard since February and March. The death rate is very high in Iran. The data is different according to the news because we don't have exact figures, but the figures are very high, and the healthcare workers are heavily impacted. Healthcare providers work very hard. They are isolated. They don't see their family, but they also don't have enough medical equipment. In order to implement politics, sanitary politics, such as the lockdown, we need to provide them with
économique précédente et vulnérabilité, où le seul partenaire économique est la Chine. On peut difficilement dire, mais pourquoi tu fais affaire avec la Chine? Vous comprenez, c'est un peu la situation qui sévit. Alors, je voulais aussi dire un peu donner un ordre d'idée. Nima a parlé tantôt du système public de santé en Iran, parce que ce que les médias du Nord global aiment faire croire, c'est qu'il y a l'Iran avec des barbus et c'est comme ça depuis 40 ans et les gens ne peuvent pas dire un mot et ne peuvent rien faire. Alors, on voit qu'il y a quand même une contradiction quand on voit des images du système de santé, des hôpitaux assez modernes en Iran présentement, tant public que privé. Malheureusement, il y a un système double vitesse suite à des mesures néolibérales adoptées par certains clans de ce régime, mais aussi encouragées par le FMI et la Banque mondiale. Donc, il y a eu des hôpitaux privés, mais à la base, ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que le pays a eu une révolution en 1979 et cette révolution était populaire et il y avait des camps, des socialistes, des communistes, des gens progressistes qui ont investi le système pour chaque fenêtre d'opportunité pour donner au peuple ce qui lui revient, donner les ressources. Et il y a eu un grand travail de santé publique qui a été fait où il y a des dispensaires élaborés et proactifs et répartis dans toutes les régions de l'Iran dès les années 80. Si on parle, par exemple, d'une autosuffisance des vaccins en Iran, ça veut dire qu'ils produisent tous leurs vaccins. Présentement, il y a une menace de pénurie dans la région de vaccins de rougeole, mais l'Iran n'est pas affecté parce qu'il les produit. il y a un personnel de haut niveau, compétent. C'est quand même des gens, je veux dire, qui se donnent corps et âme pour ça. Il y a des emplois féminines dans le système de santé qui sortent les femmes de la précarité, surtout dans les régions reculées depuis la nuit des temps. Quand il y a eu ces dispensaires de construits, les femmes ont été employées et ça a été un moyen, paradoxalement, de sortir, évidemment pas totalement, mais du joug du patriarcat en ayant des emplois féminines de qualité qui les sortaient dans la société et qui leur donnaient un poids différent dans la famille et dans la société. Et la chose importante qu'on a mentionnée tantôt, c'était que la production de plus de 95% des médicaments se fait en Iran. Alors, une des choses qui noie les systèmes de santé au Canada, au Québec, c'est le prix exponentiel des médicaments et le prix déraisonnable qu'on donne. Et alors là, ils ont réussi à contrôler, à produire localement les médicaments. Mais ce qui est grave maintenant, et c'est justement le but de ces sanctions, c'est de briser non seulement pas le gouvernement iranien, mais le peuple iranien qui a bâti ces instances-là au prix de sa vie, de ses luttes, de son sang. C'est qu'ils n'ont pas la matière première et ils n'ont pas les pièces de machine. S'ils les ont, c'est au compte-gouttes et beaucoup plus cher. Et donc, ce qui fait en ce moment défaut, c'est des médicaments de pointe, notamment en cancérologie. Ça crée aussi un marché parallèle, illégal, où on va importer évidemment, peut-être les États-Unis laissent au compte-gouttes rentrer, mais ce que ça fait, c'est que ça fait une pression sociale où certains qui ont l'argent vont pouvoir soigner leurs cancéreux et ça crée plus d'inéquité sociale. Donc, je vais citer parce que les chiffres, il y a beaucoup de chiffres, même Amnesty International s'est fait prendre dans certains, toujours, c'est-à-dire exagération, mais je pense que les sources plus fiables vont être l'ONU dernièrement. Donc, le directeur général de l'OMS, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, dit que l'Iran fait de son mieux, mais ils ont besoin d'équipement. Le Dr Ryan, le responsable sanitaire de l'OMS, dénonce aussi le manque d'équipement comme facteur aggravant de la situation de la crise en Iran, entre autres des appareils respiratoires. Ruth Marshall du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies dit que l'Iran est en crise par rapport au coronavirus parce qu'il manque de tout présentement. Le secrétaire général...
Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, asked for the sanctions to be lifted in order to apply international solidarity.
Ce pouvoir, cette grandeur de pouvoir mettre parfois les différends de côté pour le plus grand bien ou l'intérêt supérieur des peuples et finalement de collaborer, de profiter de ce temps pour exercer la collaboration, surtout que le plus, comme il disait, le maillon le plus faible, c'est le système de santé le plus faible du monde. Donc, tous les pays ont le devoir en ce moment de laisser la partisanerie de côté et de se concentrer sur cet objectif commun. Et peut-être que ça va être une leçon pour l'avenir. C'est ce que tous les humains souhaitent, que l'avenir et les relations internationales et nationales soient différents, soient sur une autre base. Alors, l'administration Pompeo, qu'est-ce qu'il répond et Trump? Que l'Iran fait ci, il fait ça et tout ça. Et donc, ils ont augmenté, je ne sais pas qu'est-ce qui restait, mais les petites, donc ils essaient des petits filets de quelque part ou je ne sais pas quoi, qu'il n'y avait pas de sanctions. Ils ont augmenté les sanctions après le COVID-19. Donc, pour ceux qui pensent, qui ont espoir que ces sanctions pourraient apporter le bien-être de la population, je pense que les doutes sont tous tombés, si on veut bien regarder de près. Et on voit on a accentué les sanctions envers Cuba, le Venezuela, l'Iran et les autres pays qui sont sanctionnés sont Gaza, la Corée du Nord et la Somalie. Ajoutons donc que les sanctions des États-Unis contre l'Iran sont condamnées par l'ONU.
The sanctions against Iran are condemned by
le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU et appellent à se lever. Donc, des sanctions de cette envergure tuent, ils violent les droits fondamentaux, ils sont l'équivalent d'une guerre, ils s'attaquent aux infrastructures, à la capacité de se procurer des pièces, des machines, des produits alimentaires, des biens essentiels, des médicaments. Ils s'attaquent à l'industrie, aux emplois les plus précaires. Ils ont fait perdre l'emploi de millions d'Iraniens, parmi eux majoritairement les femmes qui souffrent toujours plus, qui ont des emplois plus précaires. Les femmes constituent 40% de la force du travail, donc il faut encourager ça et non pas les ramener à la maison. Le peuple iranien subit des sanctions comme une agression, comme une punition collective. Ils sont contre les sanctions. Ils travaillent d'arrache-pied pour compenser ces sanctions. Dire de défendre les droits de la personne ou les droits de la femme iranienne et supporter les sanctions qui sont une claire violation des droits fondamentaux des Iraniens à exister, se soigner, vivre, démontre qu'on a acheté la thèse dominante, bien évidemment packagée, un marketing bien packagé à la fois dans les médias occidentaux, mais encore plus dans certains médias financés par les États du Nord global comme la Hollande, la Grande-Bretagne, les États-Unis et l'Arabie saoudite ont des médias de communication importants pour flipper la population, mais c'est bien un marketing, ce n'est pas la réalité. C'est l'argumentaire du département d'État américain, mais packagé. Le même département d'État qui a libéré l'Irak, la Libye, la Syrie, l'Afghanistan avec les résultats qu'on connaît. Donc, une guerre économique suivie d'une guerre chaude qui, évidemment, on sait, créera une situation encore plus catastrophique puisque l'Iran a 80 millions de population. Alors, on imagine qu'est-ce que ça peut faire comme catastrophe migratoire et humaine.
Un conclusif, s'il te plaît.
Parfait. Bien, c'est ça. Je voulais dire que la corruption est en Iran. Les erreurs des autorités sont là. Ils sont là aussi à beaucoup d'endroits. C'est difficile vraiment dans les situations actuelles de juger partout. Il faut mettre la partisanerie de côté. Moi, j'ai vu que les gens avaient de la sympathie pour Logo. C'est un peu difficile, mais dans une période de crise, on est obligé de collaborer. Ce n'est pas le temps vraiment de... Et dans une période aussi de guerre économique, c'est la même chose. Alors, c'est ça. C'est ce que j'avais à dire. Je pense que je vais arrêter de parler. Merci.
Excusez-moi, je vais juste intervenir parce qu'il y a un petit problème avec la traduction. C'est que les interprètes doivent changer de canal quand elles interprètent vers l'anglais pour que les gens qui veulent écouter en anglais puissent les entendre parce que pour le moment, ça a été un peu oublié là.
Because for now it has been forgotten.
Yes, okay.
Je me répète en anglais?
Non, c'est pas pour les conférencières, non. Non, pas du tout. C'est juste pour que les gens
this does
qui...
not concern the panelists.
Yes. So people who are listening in English, the interpreters had the wrong channel on. So unfortunately, there was a bit of confusion there. So please, now you can tune into the correct channel and you will hear the conference either in English or French. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, merci Saïdé, merci Marie pour le point.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Saïdé. We will now go to the Q&R period. We don't have much time, but we will allocate 10 minutes to the Q&R. I invite you to write your question.
Réponse que vous avez en bas sur la fenêtre de votre Zoom. Maintenant, on a quelques questions. C'est pour, on a une question pour Nima qui concerne un peu ce que Saïdé vient d'expliquer. C'est en anglais, je vais le lire en anglais. Nima, you have explained the context in which...
Nima, vous avez expliqué le contexte dans lequel le gouvernement iranien a agi avec la COVID-19. Mais considérant votre position contre le régime politique actuel, dites-vous que les sanctions économiques n'ont pas d'impact négatif dans le cadre de la crise actuelle? We have une autre question pour Nima. Vous avez dit qu'actuellement en Iran, on leur donne le médicament qui a été très impopulaire dans la presse, chloroquine. Ce médicament n'a pas fait ses preuves. Merci. Merci pour la question. Je vais essayer d'être brève. En ce qui concerne les sanctions, si les sanctions étaient uniquement dirigées vers le gouvernement iranien, je les aurais soutenues, mais elles blessent la population. C'est pour ça que je suis contre les sanctions. Vous savez, le problème de l'Iran ne concerne pas seulement les sanctions. L'un des plus grands problèmes fait partie du gouvernement qui a pris la population en otage, et ce qui complique le bien-être de la population. Les médicaments et la nourriture ne font pas partie des...
But there is a tremendous concentration of power in the hand of Sepah Pastaran. Sepah Pastaran, which is the military arm of the government, the non-official army of the government, if you want. But they are not only the non-official military arm of the government. They are an organ of persecution in Iran, and they control a huge part of the economy of the country as well. They control even the industry of dairy, milk, transformation of milk and yogurt and things like this. And this complicates the problem of importation, because when Sepah Pastaran want to buy something, they are under sanctions. But they control the distribution of drugs and medicine in Iran also. And this is a huge problem, because their objective is not to, obviously, it's not to help people to have access to those drugs, is to fill their pockets. And they sell all the drugs who comes, when they have the drug who comes, they put it in the black market and they sell it in the black market with a very huge high price. And then a few weeks later, those drugs are in the market and the people, ordinary people, can buy them. And they create voluntary shortage of those drugs. And regarding COVID, for example, Japan give 15,000 doses of medicine, Avigan, that we don't know if it's efficacious or not. There is, up to now, there is no drug proven efficacy. Its efficacy to fight against COVID, but there are many drugs who are in the market or under study, under clinical trials. But people who has those drugs, they use it anyway. One of those drugs is hydrochloroquine, and in Iran they use it. In Iran, the problem of ethics, they don't have problem with ethics. So.
Et les personnes les utilisent. Il n'y a pas de problème d'éthique, même si le médicament n'a pas encore fait ses preuves à travers des tests. Ce médicament a été utilisé dans certains pays et il y a eu des effets positifs. Même s'il n'y a qu'une petite efficacité, il faut utiliser le produit. Et c'est ce qu'ils font en Iran, parce qu'ils produisent ce médicament. Donc, ils peuvent l'utiliser. Et les personnes qui sont ici achètent ce médicament à l'Iran et l'utilisent ici. Le Japon a donné gratuitement à l'Iran 15 000 doses Et qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Ces médicaments se sont retrouvés sur le marché noir et les habitants n'ont pas eu accès à ça.
Problem, but Sepoy-Postulan is a big, they took people as a hostage in the country.
Merci, Nima. Je vous invite
Thank you, Nima. I invite you to share the links for us to get the story.
vendu en marché noir pour que les gens puissent voir les preuves de ce que vous venez de dire. Je vais poser une question à Saïdé pour conclure la période de questions-réponses de cette partie-là. Saïdé, d'abord, si vous voulez réagir à ce que Nima vient de dire, vous pouvez le faire, mais la question qu'on a, c'est on a une question pour vous. Attendez, je vais vous le trouver.
Can you answer in English? Saïd, can you answer in English? Is it possible? Or no?
You can have interpretation, Nassim, in the...
No, I know, just wondering. That's fine.
Okay. There is someone who is asking you, Saïdé, why Doctors Without Border were refused entry to Iran? And then another question.
Et une autre question. Je cherche. Merci d'écrire vos questions dans la section questions et réponses pour que nous puissions les trouver facilement. J'ai entendu qu'il y a des gens qui ont été arrêtés parce qu'ils ont parlé de la COVID-19. Est-ce que c'est vrai?
Réagissez sur ce que Nima vient à dire et répondez aux questions qui étaient posées à vous. Et après, on va arrêter dans 5 minutes la période de questions et réponses. Merci.
D'accord. Is it better that I answer in English?
Est-ce que c'est mieux que je réponde en anglais? Personne n'est arrêté parce qu'on parle en Iran.
To have the chance to go about a year and a few months ago, people are just loud in the banks, in the bus stops. They say whatever they want to say. Maybe we can say that the government cannot control people anymore in that sense because everybody has a lot of miscontent, and they only attack things that are important for them, and it's not by people speaking about COVID. Actually, their own people in the TV criticize the management. There is some exercise of debate in Iran. It's not as if, of course, there's a prohibition of political parties, and also the unions have difficulty. They exist, but they have difficulty, unions of workers. But it's not that everybody is silent. No, they have talks, debates. The left, I went to Iran to many left gatherings. It was vibrant of young people talking, speaking about national and international issues. So that's for that question. And then the other question was about, what was it about, Leila?
Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah, well, Doctors Without Borders, the problem with I don't see why they refused it. Obviously, I don't know, I'm not the Minister of Health there, and if I were, maybe I would accept them. But the thing is that it's a bit, Doctors Without Borders has a role of conscience, to go into a country from the global north and say, oh, we're coming to help you poor people, But Iran has a public system, and in some ways right now is superior to ours. And then we send those and we don't lift the sanctions. So I think the role of really the solidarity in each country, it's different. But in the other sense, I think the government, you're right, should not have forbidden. If it's to save lives, I don't know, of 10 people, why not? But that was their decision. And I think that concerning the Guardians of the Revolution, the fact of the matter, this is another package of marketing that Pompeo says. So, and the people who are paid, so in the TVs, to say, oh, well, it's not the people of Iran that we want to make suffer, it's the IRCG, the Islamic Republic Guardians. But that is nonsense, because we know they control the economy, and if we sanction them, we sanction the people, as we are doing right now. And it's just an excuse. And there is a great Canadian lobbyist here, including Benai Brit, that is activated to sort of put this in the structures, the Canadian structures, the sanctions against Iran, and that's also their argument. They never want to hurt people. They just want to, you know, help people, and with the bad, you know, bearded, you know, Islamic. But the fact of the matter is that people are dying from sanctions right now.
Qui sont propagées. Mais la réalité, c'est qu'il y a des personnes qui meurent actuellement en Iran à cause de ces sanctions. C'est la même chose au Venezuela.
In Iran, it's the same thing.
Qui sont propagées alors que des personnes meurent. Thank you, Saïd. There is a question for both panelists. I will give you 1 minute to react. One question for Nima. It's a comment. I will read it, and then maybe you could react. You can also write your answers. So one question for both panelists. The corruption situation in Iran wouldn't it have to be addressed by the Iranian population instead of Western governments, other countries? Question for Nima is, I will read it in English.
Medical professionals inside Iran and many other experts have said that the sanctions have created obstacles for import of medicine and medical equipment. For example, sanctions block banking transactions, sanctions limit Iran's access to funds for buy anything, including medicine and medical equipment. Based on what evidence does Mrs. Mashouf claim that sanctions don't affect food and medicine? Appreciate if she provides reference and evidence. Donc, si vous pouvez mettre les références de ce que vous avez dit, ce sera apprécié. Donc, Saïdé, on commence par vous, 1 minute de commentaires, et après Nima pour finir cette période. Merci.
So, Saïdé, you're going to start. Thank you. Every day, my heart is bleeding for all the people who are impacted by the dictature of the oligarchs for Qatar, Iran, and Venezuela, Cuba. We must have alternative news source, and we must know the real situation and denounce it. I know that there is solidarity from Quebec, especially since an Iranian general has been murdered in January. My friends call me and they're scared of war with Iran, and these friends are not Iranian. I was really moved by this, to see the solidarity and common sense that people have despite the dehumanization and all the stereotypes that are propagated about Iran. People are worried, and I think that peace and opposition to the sanctions are crucial right now. Merci. Thank you, Leila. Yes, the movement against corruption must be led by the people in Iran. They have to deal with it. They have to mobilize. Is it okay if I say it in French? The Iranian people must throw down the government, because this government has negative impacts on the population. It is a dictature. We must fight it, and it must be out from the inside. And that's what people do. Each year there are protests. Each year there are massacres, and prisons are crowded. People protest against the government. People that are members of unions are put in prison. Women are put in prison because they fight against the Islamic dictator in Iran. So leaders and activists are in prison because people are protesting. So the Iranian people has to change the situation. Nobody else will want our well-being as much as we want it. Concerning the sanctions, I want to give you an example. Saïdé was saying that it is false to talk about the military branch of the government. It is an organization that persecutes people. Hezbollah is under sanctions, and why do people there have drugs? Because Hezbollah is not blocking the entry of drugs. There are private companies in Iran, in the pharmaceutical industry, and other medical and health industry. Beginning, they thought they had to do all imports. So they're telling the companies and industry, you have to do your imports. This organization, the only thing they want is money. They don't care about the Iranian population. Thank you, Nima. I think we can see that there are different opinions. I invite our panelists to stay until the end. We will go to the second part of the webinar. We are going to talk about women movement in Iran. And Nassim Nourouzi is going to talk in the second part. After the QR, we are going to ask all our panelists to react again and to give their opinion. We have many questions asked in the QR section and in the chat sections. I would ask our panelists to react. You can answer to some questions in writing, because right now we have to switch to the second part.
In this part, we are going to talk about the women's movement in Iran. In the beginning, we are going to watch a 12-minute video.
On va commencer par une vidéo de 12 minutes.
And Nassim, she will talk about this video and she will comment on it. And she will
Donc, premièrement, nous allons voir une vidéo et Nassim va la commander au sujet des mouvements des femmes en Iran. Avant de passer à la vidéo, je voulais vous présenter Nassim. Elle est à l'Université de Concordia. Ses recherches sont centrées sur le complexe colonial.
Nassim is the section editor for decolonial studies in the Springer Encyclopedia of Educational Philosophy and Theory.
Elle écrit dans un journal sur le colonialisme. Elle a Donc, nous allons regarder cette vidéo de 12 minutes ensemble. Merci de rester avec nous et nous allons revenir en écoutant Nassim sur ce qu'elle a à dire.
Give me 1 second so that I can share the video. Perfect.
Il y a 40 millions de femmes en Iran. Durant des années, les femmes ont été sujettes à la répression sous le contrôle très serré de la police. C'est passé à l'histoire que les femmes de l'Iran se battent pour la justice, la paix et la liberté. « 40 millions, la lutte des femmes pour les droits des femmes en Iran. » J'aimerais vous rappeler que notre expérience commune en tant que femme, qu'on a observée à l'extérieur des prisons depuis des années, le mouvement des femmes a commencé il y a environ 150 ans. Tarek Al-In a été tuée parce qu'elle a demandé de ne pas avoir à porter un hijab et de rejoindre les hommes dans l'activisme social. Passons maintenant à l'ère moderne. De nombreuses femmes ont travaillé aux côtés des hommes autour de la révolution constitutionnelle. Malheureusement, c'est écrit dans la Constitution que les femmes ne peuvent pas voter. Donc, les femmes ont été placées au même rang que les enfants, les gens qui ont des problèmes de santé mentale. Les femmes de l'Iran ont obtenu le droit de vote et le droit d'entrer au Parlement il y a environ 60 ans, même avant les femmes de la Suisse. L'Iran est un pays où les femmes sont mieux éduquées que les hommes. Plus de 60% des étudiantes d'université sont des femmes en Iran. Soudainement, la révolution arrive au divorce et le droit de travailler sans voyager sans permission. Révolution arabe. Le gouvernement de l'Iran a accusé les femmes d'agir contre la sécurité nationale, contre les intérêts de la sécurité nationale. Après, dans les années 90, une femme s'est immolée par le feu au carré Tarshish pour protester contre le port obligatoire du hijab. Laissez-moi vous partager un de mes souvenirs. Il y a environ 10 ans, quand on faisait la campagne pour les 1 million de signatures, qui a commencé à remettre en question la discrimination contre les femmes et à lutter pour l'égalité en Iran. La campagne, on avait un bureau ici, dans un sous-sol, sur cette rue. Les femmes de toutes les expériences se sont jointes. Je suis heureuse que l'occasion soit venue pour les femmes de demander leurs droits. On se rassemblait ici pour parler des problèmes auxquels le mouvement des femmes faisait face à l'époque. Pour atteindre les droits humains, il faut absolument atteindre les droits des femmes. Agenda idéologique politique. soit loi. Quelques femmes ont commencé une campagne pour recueillir 1 million de signatures pour protester contre les lois discriminatoires contre les femmes et pour les présenter les signatures au Parlement. Mais maintenant, toutes ces activités se sont éteintes. C'est vraiment triste. Durant la présidence de Ahmadinejad, ça a été 8 ans de répression. Après 2009, mon bureau d'avocate a été démantelé par la police et tous mes collègues ont été arrêtés. Nasrin m'a représentée dans cette bataille contre le gouvernement. À cause de ce cas et d'autres cas, Nasrin est allée en prison.
من تا سال 92 در بازداشت بودم. اتفاقی که تو ذهنم برای
En prison plusieurs années, la prison change une personne. On se demande, est-ce qu'on veut se rappeler de moi? Presque tous les prisonnières ont cette sensation. Quand on s'ennuie de nos époux, de nos enfants, de nos familles. En prison, on dit, si mes mains sont attachées et mon cœur souffre, c'est parce que je veux construire un monde meilleur pour tous les enfants, incluant les miens. Dans toutes les sociétés, c'est souvent la jeunesse qui s'oppose au statu quo. De nos jours, les jeunes veulent un changement. Le port du hijab obligatoire représente l'effort de longue haleine du gouvernement pour contrôler les femmes. Aujourd'hui, les filles de la Révolution ont encore une fois montré la détermination des femmes de l'Iran de se battre pour leurs droits. Vadi était la première femme à se mettre debout sur une plateforme sur la rue de la Révolution et de retirer son hijab. Plus de 29 femmes ont retiré leur hijab et l'ont suspendu sur un bâton. Hosseini est grimpée sur une plateforme, elle a retiré son hijab, l'a suspendu sur un bâton et l'a agité. Aujourd'hui, je vais au complexe judiciaire de la discipline morale où les cas reliés à la déviance morale sont pris en charge, sont enquêtés. Elle a été accusée de 3 charges sévères, de 3 chefs d'accusation, encourager les vices et l'immoralité, retirer son hijab dans un espace public et manifestation publique d'un acte de péché. Elle pourrait être sentencée à 10 ans de prison. J'ai rassemblé toute la jurisprudence religieuse reliée au cas pour être prête pour samedi. Merci. J'ai dit au procureur que je ne voulais pas être indécente ou promouvoir la déviance. Tout ce que tu as dit, dans mon opinion, était bien réfléchi et admirable. Si toi et toutes les femmes, les activistes pour les droits des femmes n'avaient pas été là, je n'aurais pas été aussi courageuse. Nous deux, toi et moi, nous devons tenir notre parole et ne pas reculer. De nombreuses féministes, incluant des jeunes femmes qui ne sont mentionnées nulle part, parce qu'elles ne sont pas célèbres, ont été emprisonnées pour de nombreuses années. C'est le prix qu'on paye pour la liberté et la justice. Et on le paye, ce prix. Même si les lois n'ont pas changé, c'est important. Le changement important, c'est dans la façon dont les femmes se pensent et se voient elles-mêmes. Le changement a commencé. Les femmes demandent, les femmes veulent leurs droits. Quoi dire? Est-ce que je vois un meilleur futur? Je ne sais pas. Aucune société n'a rien réussi sans payer le prix, sans aucun coût. Je pense que c'est essentiel de continuer à avancer. Si ce mouvement réussit, c'est super. Mais même s'il ne réussit pas, ce sera la fondation pour de futurs mouvements, ou le fondement pour de futurs mouvements. Les deux vivent en exil et elles font face à un emprisonnement certain si elles retournent en Iran. Nasrin a été réarrêtée en juin 2018 pour son travail à la défense des droits humains et des droits des femmes. Elle a été sentencée à 38 ans de prison et 148 coups de fouet.
Thank you everyone for staying with us for this video. Before passing the mic to Nassim,
Merci tout le monde. Avant de passer le micro à Nassim, nous avons une entrevue qu'on a faite avec Nassim, qu'on voulait présenter aujourd'hui. Donc, comme elle a accepté de participer avec nous en personne, on ne va pas la partager aujourd'hui, l'entrevue, mais on va mettre le lien dans le chat si vous voulez l'écouter. Donc, Nassim, tu peux commenter sur la première partie aussi.
All right, so hi everybody, and thanks to the panelists, the previous panelists for their talk. I am very private about my taste for art, and I kind of hope that you could sort of fade my Asian collection behind me, but I don't know if it's possible or not. So I want to start with acknowledging the important work that every female activist has done so far with respect to women's rights in Iran, and acknowledge all the women who, despite all the obstacles, manage and are managing to pursue what they want. We're not bashing any of these efforts, nor underestimating their value and how important they are. Kudos to them all, and it's because of them that we're here and we're able to speak and able to criticize ourselves. In fact, one of the most poignant scenes for me in the past few decades was Nasrin Sotoudeh in prison, where upon her visit, she was upon her family visit, she was trying to pretend that she's tasting the lollipop that her son was trying to offer her through the glass barrier. And, I think I cried for 2 days. I've also written for the release of her with my students here when I was teaching at a different university. So I do want to acknowledge their great work prior to starting. I do have intense criticism to the Girls of the Revolution movement, however, the one that you saw in Time's video. Let me start with a fun note before getting to the serious stuff, actually. I think, and I have no way of proving it to you, that this was what I call as an engineered movement from outside of Iran. Now, I might be completely wrong, and I hope to be proven wrong. And I do not have any way of proving this to you, and perhaps we should wait for 30 years for the documents to get out. But I was there in the place, actually, where the first woman took off her scarf, and the first thing I told my brother was, I think the CIA might be behind this. And my brother was like, how can you say this? And I'm like, I just think so. But, I'm not talking about the participants directly being involved with outside or anything, but about the plan in general. The location was selected to be the Street of the Revolution, and even though none of the other girls took their scarves off, on that street, the name of the movement still got to be the Girls of the Revolution. You know, it's interesting because I went on Twitter a few days after that, and I saw a reporter, a foreign journalist, reporting, "This is how it all started, hashtag Girls of the Revolution." The tweet has since been deleted. And seeing how one of those people who took off her scarf is now the voice of that is being taken here and there in Canada to justify sanctions against Iran, kind of see a landing point of the movement. And you might say, all right, maybe Nassim is not just hallucinating, you know, maybe there is something there. After all, a lot of movements were designed during the Trump era to get a piggyback ride on the rightful anger of the Iranians against their government. So, you know, be on the watch for that in a few years. You can send an email to me and say, oh, Nassim, you were right, you know, this was planned, or no, you were completely wrong. As usual, I need to mention that I'm not a scholar in feminism nor in Iran's matters. I work on ethics of resistance. I basically look at how some resistances that say are progressive, and more often than not, they really want to mean it, and they want to make others free, and they want to be progressive, end up harming the very people that they're trying to liberate more than helping them in the long run. I wish we could do a critical review of the Time magazine movie about Iranian women's rights, but we don't have the time. It is the Time magazine anyways, but you know, we're going to leave that for some other time. I'll keep that critique for some other time, but I do want to take one thing from the Time video and expand on it as a question, if you don't mind. I have discussed questions similar to this before in a talk, and I do recommend you guys to watch the talk if you have the time. I'll repeat the questions here, the ones that I mentioned in the pinkwashing talk. Can we resist wrong? And are there wrong ways to resist? We're not talking about not resisting. We are not. We're talking about resisting wrongly. And I do want to continue that line of questioning, but with a twist from the Times video. Is that right? So in the Times video, what you see is the glory of fighting. You see the heroic resistance against injustice, and you say to yourself, and you see how beautiful it is, and you say to yourself how amazing it is. You see the adamant looks for fighting for freedom and for women's rights, and the respect we feel is almost intoxicating. It almost can look vicious if one wants to criticize any aspect of the struggle. One can say, how can you do this? You should be heartless. These people have been to prisons, and it is because of them that we are where we are. I think they're absolutely right. But I do think that we should nonetheless do the difficult thing, which is asking questions about what we believe is right. The question that I want to ask then is this: could behind those adamant looks and the rebellious voices and the short hairs like mine that are fighting for rights, which look heavenly, could there be a backdrop that is invisible and that we don't see it? Invisible both to us and to the heroes of our video. A backdrop of not knowing, or I'm going to call it a backdrop of ignorance and indifference about how these fights can become weaponized, hijacked, or even initiated by people who are interested in militaristic invasions, or by governments who have a history of and interest in invasions into different countries. In other words, can these fights end up not being at all about women and their rights? Could they be about accessing a land with resources, or just fighting an enemy through concepts like women's rights or human rights? And can this indifference and ignorance in our heroic fights in a militarized world cause more suffering? Just because an idea sounds progressive and heroic does not mean we should not closely examine it. Now, don't forget, contrary to what we might think, ignorance and indifference are not uncommon actually in progressive thinking, especially in the first waves of progressive thinking, and especially in North America. Feminism and calls for women's rights are definitely not exceptions. They have been susceptible to this very ignorance and indifference. Two cases that can actually easily shed light on this argument of ignorance and indifference. I'm going to talk about them. The first case is, two quotes from Susan B. Anthony and Katie B. Stanton. two American leaders of fighting for equality for women. Now, they did fight for equality, but at least at some point of their fight carried some unexamined racism with them. Now, I'm going to read the two quotes for you. The first one is from Stanton, and she says, "We are moral, virtuous, and intelligent, and yet by your laws we are classed with idiots, lunatics, and Negroes." And the other one is from Susan B. Anthony, who says, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." Now, I am taking this last quote out of context. She did campaign for African Americans and women, so please go ahead and look it up yourself if you want to have the bigger picture, and look up KDB Stanton as well. But it is the racist undertone that points to how can one be harmfully indifferent or ignorant while fighting for a progressive cause. Now, the second case is a case of Iraqi women. And even though it's repetitive, I think it never gets old, and it should never get old. We always should have this, in our minds and in our memories somewhere. So in 2003, some Iraqi women activists stood shoulder to shoulder with a hawkish US president, George W. Bush, and praised the military interventions in Iraq. Now, if you look at the video of their interview after meeting with George Bush, you can see how many times the woman says, "We're thankful to President Bush for trying to bring back dignity and freedom and liberation and liberty for the Iraqis and for the Iraqi women." Well, I mentioned in my talk on pinkwashing, I said, here we are 17 years later, after the plea of the Iraqi women to the white civilized man, and after the mission of the civilized white man was deemed accomplished, approximately 640,000 people were killed in the name of liberation, particularly in this case of the interview, particularly the liberation of women, people in one of the richest in oil countries on the planet. After 17 years, Iraq is still a battleground suffering from sectarian violence and death and poverty. So not only this, Iraq, according to a 2018 article in Huffington Post by Sandler, is a country in which women hope for death in order to escape the dire situations of violence and abuse. Now, this article, the Huffington Post article, is about how the US made life hell for Iraqi women, and the article reads, "They hoped for progress, now they hope only for death." Now, each night, it's a quote from one of the women who says, "Each night I say to myself, tonight is the night I'm going to die." Or another quote that asks, in which the woman asks herself, "Why didn't I just die in an airstrike?" So perhaps it's a mistake to assume that fighting for women's rights can be just good and nothing else. If we're indifferent or ignorant in our heroic fights, like in the first case, you can see feminism justifying racism. And it can lead to a problematic resistance called white feminism, which you can go and look it up. And in the second case, if not examined, feminism and liberty for women in one country can justify militaristic invasions and expansionism of another country. And this makes you wonder, do we need to make sure we examine the concepts, the liberation concepts that we hold dear? Do we need to take our concepts to therapy, so to speak? Hegel has this idea of conceptual therapy. A conceptual therapy shows that maybe we're not even in the territory of feminism and women's rights anymore. A conceptual therapy helps us see reality as not abstract and detached from interrelations. Women's rights movements can actually be heavily entangled and taken hostage in specific complexities, in geopolitical complexities, in war for domination, in control over resources of a land. That is why we should take our liberatory concepts and examine them through all of these complexities. Now, we see the rise right now of a third case of what can be called fighting with a backdrop of ignorance and indifference, or fighting while having this backdrop of ignorance and indifference towards harming the people we're trying to liberate. Iranian female activists allying up with Trump and Pompeo, asking to sanction Iran and even promote military invasions into Iran. A conceptual therapy would hold these activists accountable to their indifference or their complicity. Conceptual therapy would here mean asking questions, again, as I said, about the concepts these activists are using to promote something, or about their intentions, or about people or other governments behind these activists, or those who are promoting them, their liberation movements, you know. I mean, I always say this, there has to be a reason why certain women's rights activists ally up with warmongering, anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, powerful men to call for the dignity of Iranian women and their choice against mandatory hijab. There has to be a reason a Nobel Peace Laureate literally calling for oil for food or medicine, oil for medicine barter of her own people in the Canadian Parliament as suggestions to overthrow the Iranian government. And I'm talking about Ms. Ebadi, who called for such a move in the Canadian Parliament. Mind you, she says such things in English, and then in Farsi or in a Persian-speaking channel, she argues completely otherwise, because she knows that this is a gruesome and heartless suggestion, especially if vulnerable people or people vulnerable to sanction do hear this. And I have talked about this and debunked this sanctions, the myth of sanctions changing the behavior of a government in the Middle East. So, you can look up that video as well. But a feminist who is aware enough of the need for conceptual therapies and ethical resistances then would ask these activists, are you ignorant of the geopolitics of war and invasion, or are you complicit in them? Whether there's something for you in it. There is a need, therefore, to practice conceptual therapy in feminism and women's rights movements. Now, in the current world that we live in, I have news for you. A conceptual therapy is incomplete if we don't follow the money, so to speak. Check who's sponsoring the events, what kinds of grants they're receiving from which institutes. Are these institutes adversaries of the current government? What kind of think tank promoted the event? Or, who's the parliament member that is inviting these activists to our parliaments? What are their affiliations? And through these questions, we can take the concept of feminism and women's rights to therapy. Yes, it's also true, let me tell you this, it is true that the current government of Iran cracks down on movements as if it's swatting flies. But that does not take away the need on our part to be responsible and ask, are we really dealing with feminism, or is feminism sugarcoating the good old hard-to-swallow pill of invasions and domination? If we want to be allies in women's rights movements, we should constantly remind and be reminded that there is a specific backdrop of ignorance and indifference that exists both for ourselves and for Iranian feminists. Good resistance and good liberation movements ask and do not stop at a comfortable answer. They look for the very invisible backdrops of ignorance and indifference. Thank you.
Nassim, for your talk. I invite everybody to type your questions in the question and answer part so that I can see your questions. For now, we have one question or two questions for Nassim, and then I will go to two other speakers who they can comment very shortly on the second part. So, Dr. Nassim, thank you for your excellent presentation. In your opinion, what are the fundamental contextual principles needed in civil societies, such as that of Iran, to bring about positive change in their political culture and consequently the state of governance in their country? This is the first question. And the second one, aren't there legitimate Iranian women's rights movements that are not tied to hawkish players in the US government? Thank you, Nassim.
Yeah, well, I have to again mention I'm not an expert in Iran's movements, and I started with that disclaimer. So I'm absolutely certain that there might be and there are movements, legitimate movements that are not tied to outside. The problem is not them being tied to outside. The problem is this belief in and this blind faith that we have that there's hope from outside. Somebody from out, this messianic idea that somebody from outside can actually come and save us.
you know, this is a problematic thing in and of itself. So I don't think, even if it's not funding related, it's more
Il ne s'agit pas de regarder le financement, d'où vient le financement. Lorsque je parle de thérapie conceptuelle, il s'agit de vous poser la question de qu'est-ce que vous pensez savoir et qu'est-ce que vous pensez qui est vraiment bon. Est-ce qu'il s'agit vraiment de féminisme ou est-ce qu'il s'agit de ce que j'appelle le pink washing, c'est la justification de l'invasion, des sanctions, etc., parce que le gouvernement est hostile. Donc, c'est ce que vous devez garder à l'esprit. Donc, pour moi, c'est plus une question d'examiner ce que vous pensez est vrai ou ce que vous pensez savoir. Et dans mon discours sur le pinkwashing, j'ai fait une liste des choses qu'il faut se prendre en compte et se demander si vous ne causez pas plus de tort à votre peuple et si vous n'êtes pas en train de justifier des sanctions et de la violence imputée à votre peuple. Vous pouvez vous poser la question, est-ce que ce que vous défendez est réellement éthique? Quelle était la deuxième question? Quels sont les principes contextuels que nous avons besoin dans la société civile pour apporter des changements au niveau politique du pays? Encore une fois, je n'étudie pas le féminisme.
Against the women's oppression started with this binary thinking, that there is a man and a woman, and one of them is higher than the other one. The problem with binaries, I always say, is that it's not just there are two people or there are two sides. There's usually two sides, and one of them is by default considered lower than the other. And I personally think that if we replicate the fight that happened in Western societies, because what men and women were considered different and one of them were considered lower, you continue creating these false dichotomies and binaries in a society like Iran, where it was a matriarchy a long time ago. Again, don't quote me on these are just my comments. The first step for me is not creating alienation with the male gender. I think we're all in this fight together, where we are subject to oppression, yes, by the government and by the governments outside, and we need to take the feminism fight together. We should not fight for further alienation from the male or, you know, the male counterparts.
Thank you, Nassim. There are some comments going on which are not questions, so I know that you have faced such comments before, so I'll let you react if you choose to in the chat part. I will go back to our, we don't have any more questions here. I will go back to our speakers, 2 minutes each, please. And then we will go at the end back to Nassim for the concluding points. Nima, si tu veux faire un commentaire de 2 minutes, vas-y.
Nima, you have 2 minutes for conclusion. I didn't know that I could comment this part. I'll do it with great pleasure. I will do it in French. I hope the interpreters are still with us.
Avant que Pompeo arrive, avant que Trump arrive, avant que Bush arrive. Et le mouvement des femmes, juste après la révolution, a commencé à se mobiliser parce qu'ils ont vu que la révolution islamique était au détriment des droits des femmes en Iran. Et peut-être qu'au tout début, les gens disaient « Ah non, c'est parce que le volet anti-impérialiste et le volet anti-américain de la Révolution devaient prendre le dessus. » Et par la suite, on a très bien vu que finalement, c'était une révolution rétrograde, islamiste, qui nous a, en matière de droits, a fait reculer non seulement les femmes, mais beaucoup de gens dans la société. Les droits humains ont reculé même. C'était épouvantable à l'époque du Shah. La répression était épouvantable à l'époque du Shah, mais eux, ils ont fait pire que ce que le Shah était capable de faire. Les femmes ont toujours été au front, à la première ligne de front sur la lutte contre le gouvernement iranien, que les Américains, que les Russes, que les ci, que les ça, les supportent ou les supportent pas. Le mouvement des femmes vient de la société iranienne, parce que la société iranienne, le mouvement des femmes iraniennes qui sont conscientes de leurs droits et de leurs revendications, savaient qu'elles faisaient face à un gouvernement qui va sabrer dans leurs droits partout où il peut, parce que ce n'est pas du tout un gouvernement populaire, ce n'est pas du tout un gouvernement qui est là pour le bien de sa population, c'est pas un gouvernement démocrate, c'est pas un gouvernement qui va faire la promotion des droits et surtout des droits des femmes. Alors, le mouvement il y a 1 million de signatures en Iran. Si toi, tu penses que ça vient de l'extérieur et ça a été backé de l'extérieur, le mouvement contre le voile obligatoire en Iran, si tu penses que ça vient de l'extérieur, si tu penses que ça vient de l'extérieur, ce n'est pas ça. Le 1er 8 mars, après la Révolution, parce qu'à cette époque-là, ils ont commencé à vouloir nous imposer le voile aux femmes. Le 1er 8 mars, la Révolution venait à peine de tourner. Et les manifestations ont commencé. Oui, vas-y.
My French is not that good. I tried to understand as much as possible, and I realized that I can press the interpretation a bit late. I think there's a big mistake in assuming that when I'm saying, are we resisting wrong? Again, like when I say, we're not talking about not resisting. And
de dire qu'il ne faut pas résister, Nima. Peut-être que tu ne le sais pas, mais je suis née et j'ai grandi en Iran. Ça l'affecte.
To the oppression, the state oppression, perhaps more than you, because I lived my life there. If I have to tell you stories about the difficulties that I've faced, but because of religious authorities, and I always say this, I was expelled from my high school, which was a religious high school, because of doing progressive work. So I think it's a mistake to assume that whoever is calling for nuances and seeing beyond black and white is seen as, oh, you know, you're saying this and this is wrong, or you are with the whatever, the stuff that is being targeted towards us, which were not considered mainstream opposition. So, you know, I find it interesting that people who were raised in the Islamic Republic and are still calling for a mindfulness that, yes, this is a big fight, and this is a huge fight, but we need to be careful about war because we're living in a very, very specific geopolitical region. I find it bizarre that from the beginning, they are seen as oppositions to the women's rights movements or to human rights movements. And it doesn't belong to you. I think this is, again, a mainstream opposition's take. One day I have to tell you about the problems that I faced in, you know, the Islamic Republic and how difficult it was. So I kind of see it as going beyond personal interests or personal gains to, as a feminist, which, you know, it's called intersectionality. We need to be careful. It's not only women's rights, it's beyond that as well. It's war, it's a mindfulness, and our oppression as women should give us an edge and an insight to see other oppressions as well. And one of the oppressions is war, and the other one is sanctions. So this is something that, you know, we need to be mindful about. It's interesting because I also mentioned at the beginning that how fortunate we are, and it's because of these women that we are standing here and talking about it. But the fact that opposition cannot even, the mainstream opposition outside, cannot even tolerate for a second, starting with a fun note. And I say, I have no way of proving it to you. It's just an idea. And I hope I can prove it at some point. I mean, again, the fact that it has some iffy parts makes us wonder. And I did start on a controversial note, but the fact that you cannot even take this, I find it a bit similar to the mechanisms of the Iranian government, where you're like, you are downgrading our values. So you are, you know, not accepted as, you know, your comments are not acceptable because you're downgrading our values. And, you know, the same thing goes in Iran. You are not accepting our values and we're going to, you know, threaten you and whatnot. So I think there needs to be a mindfulness about how we see critiques to resistance movements and about the movement of them existing before the Iranian Revolution. I was not the one who changed the Shah's government. I was not the one who, and I said it in one of my videos, I said, your parents will tell you that all of the people that wanted the revolution to happen, no, not all of them, but 80% of the opposition that is outside perhaps would say, you know, we didn't want it to turn out this way. It was hijacked, it was this, that. That's exactly what we're doing. We're calling attention that if you sanction, you know, this entity and that entity, you're causing harm to people because you think the concepts that you hold true and dear are so precious that you cannot even examine the consequences. The thing we are trying to do as people who are anti-war and anti-sanctions is precisely not to make the mistake that you guys did and left us with a legacy to have to deal with this right now. So keep that in mind when criticizing and, you know, going ahead. So, yeah.
Leila, I hope that you didn't count my 2 minutes, what Nassim said in my 2 minutes.
You had already finished your 2 minutes. I give you 30 seconds.
I'm sorry, I didn't even begin my 2 minutes. She used them. So I will take my 2 minutes
30
now.
seconds to finish what you wanted to say. And then because we have 2 other questions for Nassim, we're going to go back to questions and then...
Yeah. But you had to tell to Nassim, so to don't use my time. Anyway, Nassim, of course that I know that. Where are you coming from? I was answering to you that you said, can we strongly resist? And you were talking about
I never said strongly, I said wrongly, my friend.
About indifference and ignorance, even when we fight. So I was talking about that. Of course, we know that many other, there are other forces that they went to struggle about Iran, or US want to change the Iranian government because they have their own reasons. Do you think really, the question that you ask me, ask to yourself, do you really think that if we fight for human rights in Iran, it's
pour les droits des femmes en Iran, c'est parce que nous sommes pro-américains? Est-ce que tu penses vraiment que nous ne sommes pas au courant que les États-Unis ont énormément d'intérêts économiques, politiques et géopolitiques en Iran? Bien sûr que nous sommes au courant.
Pour prouver ton point, tu viens mélanger des affaires qui n'ont rien à voir à mélanger. C'est pas parce qu'on est anti-américain et j'en suis une. C'est pas parce qu'on est contre la guerre et j'en suis une.
How would you address it?
C'est pas parce qu'on est contre le gouvernement iranien qu'on est...
Iranian, you're mixing up things. What you're saying is nonsense and lies.
Ses opposants. Écoute ce que les gens ont.
You have to listen to what people are saying and what they want in their fight. You have to ask yourself if it's right or not. If it's not right, then you can take some distance and say, this is not right, I don't want to defend this. But if it's right, you cannot negate the importance. You cannot negate the importance of the fight for democracy.
My suggestion is, what is your solution? How should we address this, Ms. Mashouf? Should we ally up with people who are have strong lobbies and strong interests in adversaries of Iran? And I'm not talking about the Iranian government, I'm talking about these historical histories of adversaries. Should we ally up with them, with Mr. X, Mr. Y, to sort of say, all right, we're holding Iran accountable, and should through that holding accountable, we impose sanctions and cut the medicine? And people say medicine is not medicine.
Again,
they say medicine is not under sanctions. As my friend one time said, try sending a medicine right now to Iran. Try doing it right now. Just send.
When Corona began,
try, and again, this is not my field of expertise, but try sending a medicine right now. You do it yourself. Buy a pack of medicine and try to send it to Iran and see if, according to because of the US sanctions, you can actually manage to send medicine in Iran. And I always say, my close member of the family died because of the imposition of sanctions. Mm-hmm. So enough with saying that the Islamic Republic is unjust. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. No one is denying that fact. Mm-hmm. The fact that I'm not wearing a scarf, and when I go to Iran, I have to wear a scarf, shows that fact. But the point is, should we be mindful that because we are hating something, we are causing more suffering and harm through people that are not interested in our rights? So is your solution, seems to be, allying up with people that are pro-war for Iran, pro-sanctions for Iran. You know, we can see the pictures here and there. And whenever someone says, hey, hold on a second, don't come inside of Iran, don't do this, this is not right. It happened in Iraq. Don't you know that human rights abuses in Iraq was a severe thing? Women wanted to be secular again, but see what happened. We don't disagree on the fact that Iran has problems. The only thing we disagree on is how we can be ignorant in causing more suffering and harm, right? Yeah. And I really, really recommend you to use your, like when you are giving comments about the IRGC or about COVID, try to back them up by references, because I think sometimes we see this line of, like, it's, you know, we have propaganda by the Islamic Republic and we also have propaganda by the opposition. It's like they have bullet points and talking points, and you guys have a set of talking points that you go through. It's taking people hostage, is doing this and that, and kind of like, all right, give me the facts, give me some documents proving this. You cannot just say that 1,000 people, 3,000 people were killed. Maybe more were killed, maybe less, maybe there were 10,000 people. But the fact that you are not using your sources right discredits you and disqualifies your arguments. You know,
I will send you the code. I will send you the references.
Health, I kind of find it bizarre.
Yeah, the references.
Yeah. I don't know.
And I have a question for you. I have a question for you.
Please, I will ask you to please stop, sure, because we don't want to dialogue. It's unless you finish what you were saying.
Just say that if you have references, use them. If you don't have references, say I'm saying this without references. It's not really academic to say stuff without references.
Thank you, Nassim. Actually, we have, I will ask Nima, Nassim, and Saide to send us the references of what they said, and we will put them on the Facebook page. I think it will be easier for everybody to follow up on that. Actually, we have a question for Nassim about this. Someone says, Dr. Nourouzi, could you please provide more info about pro-sanction lobbyists active in Canada, especially those who, in your opinion, are using pink-washing tactics to advocate for sanctions and war? Yeah. So I understand the references about that, because we have other questions also. We have a question for Nima. I will let you comment on that in writing, or if we have time at the end. It says, Dr. Nima, you chose to consciously exclude women with religious orientation in their socio-political thoughts from women's movements in Iran. A strong personality as such that comes to mind is Madame Azam Talegani. What is your justification for omitting such strong force, which also represent the majority of Iranian society? I want to...
Can I? Because the answer is short.
15 seconds, and then we decide.
Non, je ne sépare pas du tout les femmes musulmanes qui sont dans la lutte pour...
I'm not separating Muslim women who are fighting for women's rights. It is...
leur affiliation religieuse, surtout dans le mouvement pour Yek Million Emza, 1 million signature. Tout le monde était ensemble. On l'a vu aussi dans le vidéo, et aussi sur contre le voile obligatoire. Même les femmes musulmanes progressistes en Iran sont contre le voile obligatoire en Iran.
Merci. Je vais lire, I will read the last question that we have.
Merci. Je vais lire la dernière question. Et après que Saïdé ait parlé, nous allons donner la parole à Nassim pour la conclusion, puis nous allons terminer le webinaire.
So the question is in French, so Nassim, if you want to turn on the interpretation. Un point important est abordé.
Hold on. Wait.
Okay.
Hold on. Okay, I think, go ahead.
There is an important point that our countries of the South are often confronted to. We don't want to sacrifice our own dynamics. There are different positions in the feminist movement. Is it the same in Iran?
It says that in the countries of the South, we are facing this problem that you talked about, that we are taken advantage
Problème
of.
auquel vous faites face, que d'autres mouvements détournent les causes et qu'il y a différents opinions par rapport au mouvement des femmes. Est-ce que cela est également le cas en Iran?
Saïd, you're mute.
Sorry. Should I answer in French or in English?
Comme tu veux.
Okay. Alors oui, yes, it exists. In Iran, there is, it's a really vibrant society and
une division dans la société. Parce qu'il y a tellement de problèmes et les problèmes sont tellement complexes. Je pense qu'il est important de nuancer nos discussions. Je suis d'accord, les choses que nous entendons traditionnellement depuis des décennies sont connues, ce sont des points que l'on connaît. Mais je ne me sens pas valorisée lorsqu'en tant que femme, lorsqu'on insinue qu'elles ne sont pas au courant de toute la situation. Les femmes sont très conscientes de...
But what we see is also a mainstream opposition that is right now promoted by a strong propaganda, because as we know, we have...
Il y a une propagande, comme vous le savez, il y a des sanctions qui composent une guerre économique, mais il y a également une guerre d'information et il faut faire très attention. Par exemple, parce que nous avons des informations de la BBC,
hugely financed TV channels coming from USA, Saudi Arabia, and
de l'information qui vient des États-Unis, de l'Arabie Saoudite. Et bien sûr que toutes ces informations ne sont pas forcément pour le droit des femmes. Nous devons avoir notre propre voix indépendante si nous voulons réellement être la voix de l'Iran. Nous ne pouvons pas aller à l'étranger pendant 50 ans.
Go to Iran to meet. We need to organize grassroots. We cannot just sit in our living room, chat, and then...
Et aller sur le terrain. Nous ne pouvons pas juste être dans notre salon et véhiculer des informations qui sont véhiculées par l'administration américaine.
Information warfare, and unfortunately they're preparing for
de l'information. Et malheureusement, on se prépare également une guerre militaire. Nous devrions toutes, en tant que femmes, être contre la guerre. Merci, Saïdé, pour tes commentaires. Nassim, la parole sera.
Challenges that you have faced because of challenging the mainstream opposition against Iranian government. So I know that we are in the same subject right now. You talked about pinkwashing, and then It's the conflict that it's causing. Anxiety is talking about the same thing. So we have from one part sanctions and how the governments are using sometimes women movements in Iran to impose their agenda onto people. And then from the other part, we have women's movement who want to be legitimate and they want to create change. So I let you finish on that. And if you have any other comments, we have like 2 minutes to finish. Thank you.
I've been called, it's been really fun. It depends on what you mean by fun, but it's been really fun after the talk I gave on pinkwashing. Before I was
le discours que j'ai fait sur pinkwashing, et nous n'avons pas réellement parlé de pinkwashing ici, mais après cela, j'ai été traitée de nombreux noms. Quelqu'un qui défend la République islamique. J'ai été traitée de prostituée.
A few permanent trolls on Twitter that keep threatening to deport me from Canada. I have people who constantly interrogate me.
Des personnes qui me posent constamment des questions. Il y a eu 3 campagnes de diffamation et des mauvaises traductions de mes posts sur Twitter. Et j'ai même été traitée de fasciste. C'est mon préféré car je pense que les gens ne savent même pas vraiment ce que cela veut dire.
Saida rightly mentioned is benefiting a lot of channels and network channels outside of Iran. The minute you do that, you're sort of being attacked by being a regime mercenary. I don't know if that's the right translation, but I've been called all of these things. So, you know, it's been very interesting because it makes you more adamant to feel that, okay, you know, you want to be in opposition to the Islamic Republic. And there is this opposition to the Islamic Republic that is doing exactly the same things that Iran's government is doing when they want to crush their voices. It's just that they don't have the physical tools to do it. They try to do it through psychological torture, through smearing, through trolling, through, you know, death threats. I had to go to the police because of the death threats that I received. But most of the time, it's this suspicion that, are you with the Islamic Republic? I mean, that's a polite way of saying it. Other people say,
est-ce que je suis alliée avec la République islamique? Est-ce que je suis leur prostituée? Tout cela est vraiment très dommage. Je pense que c'est très triste de vivre dans une communauté qui est fatiguée et frustrée, qui en a assez de la violence qu'il y a en Iran, mais qui réplique exactement.
To silence, you know, voices that are opposed to theirs. You know, in Iran, when you go to protest, you're immediately
les voix qui essaient de nuancer les propos. Je pense qu'il est important pour les personnes de voir qu'il y a plus de choses à faire. Il faut faire des recherches et il faut prendre en compte l'ignorance et l'indifférence. Il faut essayer de voir au-delà de ça pour ne pas faire les mêmes les mêmes erreurs. Je veux que mes neveux et mes nièces aient un avenir différent. Je ne veux rien de ce qui est influencé par l'extérieur, par d'autres pays. Je vais retourner en Iran et élever éventuellement mes enfants en Iran. Et en même temps, je ne veux pas non plus des sanctions sur l'Iran.
To all our speakers, only to conclude, I wanted to say that today, if we can see the colorful political scene of the Iranian community, and if we start to hear each other, it's a step, because it's not black and white. We should see that the ones who are the mainstream opposition, they have a point of view, but they have to start. I hope that they start to listen to what others have to say, who are not for any government. They are for freedom, for democracy, and for justice and for peace. So we have to start to hear what other people have to say. And I think if we start this step, we can start a dialogue and we can create a better atmosphere to talk about different issues and to solve our problems and to make a change in our community. But if we don't do that, we wouldn't be able to hear what the other part has to say. If we just put some names or etiquettes on the people who are against what we think, it won't work. The dialogue won't work. So I think that the talk about Iran and the women movement in Iran and with the speakers that we have with different points of view could show us the colorful scene of what people think in the community, and let's start to hear that and to create a dialogue. So I would like to thank everyone, all the attendees, all the panelists, and our technical support.
1 million signature campaign was from outside, just as a record. I was talking about the children, Girls of Revolution, and I was just making a hypothesis, nothing to be proven yet.
Thank you, Nassim. And I invite our panelists to send on our Facebook page, under the event page, the resources they would like to share with others so that they can understand, or they can, what they said can be justified. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish the webinar now. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. And please check.
I'm
Please.
answering the question that were in the conversation.
We have to shut it off
in
now.
the Facebook, or I answer here?
In the Facebook, because we have to shut it down now. The time is up. But please check the YouTube channel, because the whole thing has been recorded, and we'll put it up. Yes, on the YouTube channel, Women of Diverse, WDO-FDO YouTube. Thank you very much. It was very vibrant and lively discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.